Distant echoes of haunting carnival music drifted through the autumn night, threading through the trees and thickening the air with a subtle, almost sickly sweetness. A fog hung low over the town of Carverville, casting the streets in a ghostly pallor, as if even the night itself had been infected by something foul. Amanda shivered as she tightened her scarf against the creeping cold, her breath fogging in the air. Beside her, Jake chuckled, oblivious to the weight of dread that seemed to press down on them all. "You know," he said with a grin, "this carnival only shows up once every 10 years. I heard they only come to places where something bad happened." "You're full of crap," Darren scoffed, flicking his cigarette to the ground. "It's just some traveling freak show. We'll see some weird stuff, get creeped out, then head to the bar after. Easy night." But Amanda wasn't so sure. Ever since she'd heard the whispers about the carnival returning, an inexplicable unease had settled in her gut. She didn't tell the others, but her mother had mentioned this place once when she was a child, warned her to stay far away if she ever saw it. "That carnival is cursed," her mother had said, the words carrying a heaviness Amanda hadn't understood back then. But now the memory clung to her, and no matter how hard she tried to shake it, the feeling of dread only intensified with every step they took toward the carnival's entrance. As the group neared the carnival grounds, the towering gates came into view. They were old, rusted iron twisted into grotesque shapes, faces that snarled and screamed, bodies contorted unnaturally in twisted knots of metal. Above it all, a faded banner read, "Freakshow, where monsters are born." The paint had chipped away in places, revealing an ominous hint of red beneath, as though the sign itself had been dipped in blood. "Charming," Melanie muttered under her breath, her voice strained as she scanned the entrance. "Are we really doing this?" "We came this far," Jake said, nudging her playfully. "Might as well see what all the fuss is about." Amanda swallowed hard and forced a smile, but her heart thudded painfully in her chest. The group paid for their tickets at a small, weathered booth where the ticket taker's gnarled hands reached out to them with sickly, yellowing nails. His eyes, dull, gray, and glassy, tracked their every movement, though he said nothing. There was a faint smell of decay around him, as if the man himself had been rotting from the inside out. "Enjoy the show," he rasped, his voice barely above a whisper, as if the effort to speak was too much for him. They passed through the gates and into the carnival proper. Immediately, the atmosphere changed. The air grew heavier, thicker, like breathing through damp cloth. The music was louder now, but not quite right. It was off-kilter, as though the notes were slipping out of tune, warping in time with the flickering, dim lights that illuminated the sprawling carnival grounds. The carnival itself was like a labyrinth, sprawling in every direction, but no matter where Amanda looked, she couldn't find the edges. It seemed to stretch on endlessly into the darkness, the boundaries of reality dissolving as soon as they stepped inside. Tents of every size and color loomed in strange, asymmetrical shapes, some slanted at unnatural angles, their canvas flaps flapping weakly in the wind. A grotesque Ferris wheel loomed overhead, its carriages twisted and sagging like they were barely held together. Dark shadows shifted behind every corner, always just out of sight, watching. Something was wrong here. Something was very, very wrong. The group ventured deeper into the carnival, and it wasn't long before the performers began to appear, first in the corners of their vision, and then more boldly, walking among them. Amanda caught sight of a man whose legs were twisted backward, his body slumped forward unnaturally as he staggered past them. Another performer, a woman, floated eerily a few inches above the ground, her body stretched unnaturally tall, her limbs thin and elongated like some macabre puppet on strings. None of them spoke. They just watched. Jake, ever the skeptic, turned to the group with a mocking grin. "Well, this is just charming. Where do you think they find these people?" Amanda didn't answer. She couldn't tear her eyes away from a particularly disturbing figure. A man, or at least what had once been a man. His skin was taut and translucent, so thin that she could see his veins, his muscles, even the slow, rhythmic pulsing of his organs beneath the surface. His face was twisted in permanent agony, eyes wide and unblinking, but his lips were pulled into a grotesque smile, as if some unseen force was holding them in place. Melanie looked like she was about to be sick. "This doesn't feel right," she whispered. "I think we should leave." But when they turned back toward the entrance, it was gone. The gates had vanished, swallowed by the shifting maze of tents and carnival attractions. Where once there was a clear path out, now there was only an endless sprawl of canvas, flickering lights and shadows that moved just a bit too quickly. "Shit," Darren muttered. "We just came through here. Where the hell did the exit go?" Panic began to set in, but Jake, ever the level-headed one, laughed it off, though his voice sounded strained. All right, don't freak out. It's probably just part of the show, right? They're messing with us. We'll find our way out soon." But Amanda wasn't so sure. She could feel it, something in the air, in the ground beneath their feet, in the very fabric of the carnival itself. It was alive and it was watching them. She reached up to wipe the sweat from her forehead and froze. Her skin, it felt wrong, slick and smooth, almost like wax. She pulled her hand away and stared at it in horror as her fingertips left faint impressions on her skin, as if it had begun to melt. She gasped and stumbled backward. "Something's wrong. We need to get out of here. Now." Jake frowned, stepping closer to her. "What do you mean? What's—" Before he could finish, a sharp, crackling voice echoed through the carnival, bouncing off the tents and twisting unnervingly in their ears. The voice was high-pitched, almost sing-song, and yet there was something deeply unsettling beneath the jovial tone. "Welcome, one and all, to the Freak Show. Step right up. Don't be shy. Come closer and see the wonders and horrors that lie just beyond the veil of your very perception." The group froze, their eyes drawn to a figure emerging from the shadows. He was tall and thin, his limbs too long, his movements unnaturally fluid, as though his joints bent in directions they shouldn't. His face was pale and gaunt, his lips painted a garish red in a permanent smile. His eyes, though, they were black as pitch, hollow pits that seemed to pull the light from the air around him. He wore a tattered ringmaster's coat, his skeletal hands beckoning them closer. "My name," he purred, his voice laced with a sickening sweetness, "is Vance. And tonight, my dear guests, you are the stars of the show." Jake stepped forward, his voice defiant. "What the hell is this? Some kind of trick?" Vance's smile widened, his teeth too sharp, too white. "No trick, my friend. Only the truth. Here at the Freak Show, you will become more than you ever imagined. You will be transformed, reborn into something magnificent." Amanda's skin tingled again, and when she looked down, she saw it shifting, just slightly beneath her clothes. She bit her lip to keep from screaming. Vance extended his hand toward them, his grin widening even further. Now, if you'll just follow me." And with that, he turned and melted back into the shadows, the carnival stretching and warping around them, beckoning them deeper into its nightmarish embrace. Amanda's heart raced as she took a step forward, her skin still tingling unnervingly. She didn't want to go, but something inside her, something dark and cold, pushed her on. And as they followed Vance into the heart of the carnival, she couldn't shake the feeling that they had already crossed a threshold from which there was no return. Something had begun, and it would not stop until it had consumed them whole. The entrance to the main tent stood before them like a giant gaping mouth. Its flaps were torn and ragged, the fabric coated in something dark that might have been mud. Or worse, the air had grown colder, sharper, and with every step Amanda took, she felt her body tingling as though an invisible current was surging just beneath her skin. Her stomach twisted in knots as they passed through the entrance, the tent swallowing them whole. Inside, the darkness was thick and suffocating. Only a few dim lights flickered overhead, casting grotesque shadows on the walls. The scent of decay was overwhelming now, a putrid stench that clung to their clothes and invaded their lungs. The seats, arranged in a circle around a central stage, were worn and stained, the fabric sagging as though exhausted from holding the weight of too many bodies. It seemed that no one had been there for years, yet the air buzzed with an unspoken anticipation. "God, it smells like death in here," Melanie muttered, holding a sleeve up to her nose. "Let's just get this over with," Darren said, his voice strained. His eyes darted nervously around the tent, unable to focus on anything for too long. Something had changed in him since they entered the carnival. He was always the tough guy, the one who never let fear show. But Amanda could see it in the way his hands twitched and his gaze wavered. Darren was afraid. The four of them sat down in the front row, and for a moment, all was still. The silence stretched on until it became unbearable, a weight pressing down on their chests. Just as Amanda was about to speak, the lights overhead flickered again, once, twice, and then with a sickening hum, the stage came to life. The freak show had begun. Vance appeared first, his figure emerging from the shadows like a phantom. He moved with unnatural grace, his long limbs flowing as if they were liquid. The smile he wore was wide and manic, stretching across his gaunt face in a way that made Amanda's stomach churn. His eyes, black and empty, scanned the audience, or rather scanned the four of them, before settling on Amanda. She felt the weight of his gaze like cold fingers tracing her skin. "Welcome," he purred, his voice as smooth as silk. "To the show of wonders, the spectacle of horrors, where you will see things that defy the very fabric of reality. Our performers, well, they are unlike any you've ever seen. They are born of fear, of pain, of the darkest depths of human nature." As he spoke, the curtains behind him parted slowly, revealing the first performer. Amanda's breath caught in her throat as the figure stepped forward. A woman, or at least what was left of one. Her body was painfully thin, her skin stretched tight over bones that jutted out at unnatural angles. Her arms were long and spindly, the joints seeming to bend backward, and her neck was so elongated that it resembled a twisted vine. But her face was the worst of all. Her mouth was sewn shut, blackened threads pulling her lips into a permanent, grotesque smile. Her eyes were wide and bloodshot, filled with a terror that Amanda could feel deep in her own bones. "This," Vance announced, gesturing grandly to the woman, "is Seraphine, the contortionist. Watch as she bends her body into shapes that should not be possible, shapes that defy the human condition. Seraphine began to move then, her limbs creaking like old wood as she twisted her body into horrific, unnatural poses. Her bones cracked and popped with each movement, her joints rotating in ways that should have been impossible. Amanda watched in horror as the woman folded herself in half, her spine snapping audibly but continuing to bend. Her head lolled unnervingly, like a broken doll, yet her eyes never left Amanda's. It wasn't just the physical impossibility of Seraphine's contortions that disturbed Amanda. It was the feeling that Seraphine had no control over her own body, that some unseen force was twisting and molding her against her will. Her eyes, filled with silent pleading, seemed to scream for release, for mercy. But there was none to be had. The show went on. One by one, the performers emerged from the shadows, each more grotesque than the last. There was Victor, a man whose flesh seemed to be melting off his bones like wax, dripping onto the stage with a sickening splatter. He spoke through a distorted, gurgling voice, his words barely intelligible as his mouth shifted and reformed continuously. Then came Celia, a singer whose throat had been slit wide open. Amanda could see the raw, exposed flesh, yet somehow she still sang. The sound that came out was haunting, a mournful wail that echoed through the tent and sent chills down Amanda's spine. But the real horror came when Celia pulled at the edges of her wound, stretching it wider until something slithered out. A long, blackened tendril, writhing like a parasite. The audience could see it was not Celia singing, but the creature within her, puppeteering her from the inside. With each act, the atmosphere grew more suffocating, the boundaries of reality crumbling under the weight of the grotesque horrors they were witnessing. Amanda's head began to pound, and her skin itched furiously. She scratched at her arms absent-mindedly, but the sensation only grew worse. When she finally looked down, her heart skipped a beat. Her skin was changing again. It shifted beneath her fingertips as though it was no longer flesh but something softer, more malleable. She gasped, trying to keep calm, but the horror clawed at her from the inside. Beside her, Darren's paranoia was visibly intensifying. He kept glancing around the tent, his eyes wide and frantic. He muttered under his breath words that Amanda couldn't quite make out, but they were filled with panic. He kept rubbing his temples as though trying to rid himself of voices only he could hear. Jake leaned forward in his seat, his eyes glued to the stage, but there was something wrong with him too. His face was pale, and his hands shook slightly as though he was fighting off some inner darkness. Amanda noticed the way his fingers clenched the edge of his seat, knuckles white with tension. The final act of the night arrived, and it was the one that broke them. Vance stepped forward, his eyes gleaming with sadistic pleasure. "And now, for the grand finale," he announced, his voice dripping with malevolence. "I present to you the newest additions to our family." The curtains parted, and Amanda felt her blood run cold. 4 figures stood on the stage, their bodies twisted and deformed in horrific ways. The first was a woman whose skin was stretched taut over a bloated, pulsating mass, her flesh barely containing the growths beneath it. The second was a man whose limbs had been elongated unnaturally, his arms and legs bending and coiling like serpents. The third was a creature whose entire body was covered in razor-sharp teeth, each one gnashing hungrily as it moved. And the fourth, The fourth was a nightmare made flesh, its body a grotesque mockery of the human form, with limbs twisted and contorted into impossible shapes. But that wasn't the worst of it. Amanda's heart seized in her chest as she recognized their faces. Her face, Darren's face, Jake's face, Melanie's face. They were looking at themselves, twisted, grotesque versions of themselves. Amanda couldn't breathe. She stumbled backward, clutching her head as it spun wildly. She could hear Jake's voice, distant and strained, yelling something she couldn't understand. Darren was on his feet, his hands gripping his hair as he shook his head violently. Melanie was crying, her body shaking uncontrollably as she stared at the twisted reflection of herself on the stage. It wasn't possible. None of this was possible. But as the figures on stage moved, mimicking their every gesture with disturbing accuracy, Amanda felt something deep inside her begin to break. Her skin, her cursed, shifting skin, began to melt away again, revealing the same twisted, pulsating flesh that she had seen on her doppelganger. She screamed. The world around them warped and twisted, the tent walls bending and groaning as though they were alive. The lights flickered wildly, casting eerie shadows over everything. Amanda could hear Darren's panicked breaths, Jake's frantic swearing, Melanie's sobs, but they all felt distant, as though they were trapped in a nightmare they couldn't wake from. Vance's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and cruel. "Welcome to the Freak Show," he whispered, his grin widening. "You're one of us now." The entrance to the Hall of Mirrors loomed before them, a twisted archway of polished glass and jagged shards. Above the entrance, a sign flickered with weak light, the letters barely legible beneath layers of grime. "Face your reflection. Confront your truth." A chill ran down Amanda's spine as she read it, the words seeming to burrow into her mind like an echo she couldn't shake. The others stood beside her in tense silence. Darren was shaking, his hands twitching at his sides as he rubbed his temples, his breath coming in short, rapid bursts. Melanie hadn't stopped crying since the Freak Show tent, her hands trembling violently as she tried to wipe away tears that wouldn't stop flowing. Jake was the quietest of all, but there was a darkness in his eyes that Amanda had never seen before, a coldness that sent a wave of nausea through her stomach. But they had no choice. The carnival had them now, and there was no escape. The exit had long since disappeared, swallowed by the shifting maze of the carnival grounds. They could feel it in the air, the carnival's presence, like a living thing. Hungry, waiting, watching. "We need to keep moving," Jake finally said, his voice low and hoarse. "This place is messing with us. We can't stay here." Amanda nodded, though her limbs felt heavy, her skin still tingling unnervingly. It had been growing worse since the Freak Show. The more time she spent in the carnival, the less she recognized herself. Her skin didn't feel like her own anymore. Too soft, too malleable. She had caught her reflection in a puddle earlier and had to look away. The face staring back at her wasn't hers. It was something else entirely. Something wrong. They stepped into the Hall of Mirrors. Inside, the air was suffocatingly thick, the stench of sweat and mildew clinging to every breath. The narrow corridor was lined with mirrors of all shapes and sizes, some pristine and polished, others cracked and warped. The dim lights overhead flickered weakly, casting erratic shadows that twisted and writhed along the walls. The mirrors stretched onward endlessly, creating a dizzying maze of reflections that distorted reality with each step they took. Amanda glanced to her left, catching a glimpse of herself in one of the mirrors, but immediately regretted it. Her reflection stared back at her with wide, hollow eyes, her skin rippling unnaturally as though it were alive. She recoiled, trying to shake the image from her mind, but the mirror seemed to pull at her, its reflection warping, twisting into something unrecognizable. "What the hell is this place?" Darren muttered under his breath, his eyes darting from one mirror to the next, his reflection multiplying and shifting in grotesque ways. I don't understand what's happening." "Don't look," Jake said sharply, though his own voice trembled. "Just keep your eyes forward. Don't look at them." But it was impossible not to. The mirrors were everywhere, lining every inch of the narrow corridor, reflecting back their worst fears in endless distorted forms. No matter which way they turned, they were confronted with their own twisted images, faces bloated and swollen, limbs elongated unnaturally, skin bubbling and splitting open to reveal grotesque, writhing masses beneath. The Carnival had sunk its claws deep into them, and it was tearing them apart from the inside. As they ventured deeper into the labyrinth, the mirrors became more twisted, more violent in their distortions. Amanda's reflection now showed her body melting, her skin sagging off her bones like wax, her features warping and dripping until her face was nothing but a featureless mass of flesh. She tried to tear her eyes away, but it was like the mirror had taken hold of her, forcing her to confront the nightmare version of herself. Her breathing quickened. She reached up to touch her face, her fingers trembling. For a moment she feared she would feel the same soft, yielding flesh that her reflection showed. But no, her skin was still intact. But for how long? She heard Melanie gasp behind her and turned just in time to see her friend stumble backward, her hands covering her mouth in horror. Melanie's reflection had split into several versions of herself, each one more grotesque than the last. One version had skin that was stretched taut over an emaciated skeleton, her bones visible beneath the surface like fragile glass. Another version had her entire body covered in what looked like thick black veins, pulsing and writhing just under the surface, as though something was crawling through her veins, trying to break free. Melanie let out a strangled sob. I can feel it," she whimpered. "It's inside me. I can feel it moving." "Stop looking," Jake snapped, grabbing Melanie by the shoulders. "It's not real. None of this is real. You have to focus." But even Jake was starting to break. His own reflection had taken on a monstrous form, a hulking figure with twisted, bloodied hands and a face that was half melted, revealing jagged bone and muscle beneath. He was no longer just a man. He was a predator, a killer. His reflection grinned back at him, eyes gleaming with a savage hunger that made Amanda's blood run cold. Darren, too, was unraveling. His reflection showed him as a bloated, swollen figure, his skin stretched grotesquely over his body, covered in mouths, hundreds of them, small and wide, opening and closing with wet, sucking sounds. The mouths whispered to him, taunting him, telling him secrets only he could hear. His hands trembled as he clutched his head, trying to block out the voices, but it was no use. They were inside his mind now, worming their way deeper with each passing second. I can't do this," Darren whispered, his voice shaking. It's all wrong. We're trapped." Amanda's heart pounded in her chest as panic surged through her veins. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The mirrors were closing in around them, warping and twisting their reflections into something inhuman, something monstrous. And the worst part was that Amanda knew. Deep down, she knew. These weren't just illusions. They were becoming real. The carnival was changing them, turning them into the very freaks they had once feared. The corridor seemed to stretch on endlessly, each mirror reflecting a more distorted version of reality. A deeper descent into madness. Amanda's reflection now showed her as a shifting, formless mass of flesh and bone, her limbs elongating and warping into grotesque shapes. Her face had completely melted away, leaving nothing but a blank, featureless expanse of flesh where her features had once been. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the image, but the sensation remained. Her skin tingled unnervingly, and she could feel it shifting beneath her clothes, her flesh rippling as though it were no longer solid. Her hands trembled uncontrollably, and for a moment she was terrified that if she looked down, she would see the same grotesque mass that her reflection had shown her. "Keep moving," Jake said, though his voice was ragged now, barely above a whisper. "We have to keep moving." But as they pressed on, the mirrors began to change. The reflections no longer showed just distortions of their bodies. They showed things that shouldn't have been possible. They showed Amanda and her friends in places they had never been, doing things they had never done. One mirror showed Amanda standing over a corpse, her hands drenched in blood, a cold smile twisting her lips. Another showed Darren, his bloated, twisted body towering over a group of horrified onlookers as the mouths on his skin opened wide and devoured them whole. "Look," Melanie whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of her own choked sobs. "Look at them. They're us. But they're not." The realization struck Amanda like a blow to the chest. These reflections weren't just twisted versions of themselves, they were their futures. The carnival was showing them what they were becoming, what they would be if they stayed. And worse, it was showing them that there was no escape. Amanda could feel the carnival's influence deep within her now, like a parasite worming its way through her veins, rewriting her very flesh. Every step she took felt heavier, slower, as though the transformation was already beginning to take hold. She could feel her skin shifting, stretching, as though it was no longer hers to control. Her thoughts were becoming jumbled, tangled with dark urges that weren't her own. Suddenly, they reached a dead end. The corridor ended in a massive mirror that towered over them, its surface pristine and polished to a perfect shine. It reflected all four of them, but these weren't the distorted, grotesque reflections they had seen before. These were perfect, exact replicas of themselves. Amanda, Jake, Melanie, and Darren, standing side by side, staring back at them with cold, blank eyes. And then, slowly, the reflections began to smile. It was a slow, unnatural movement, their lips curling upward in eerie synchronization. The smiles stretched too wide, the corners of their mouths splitting open to reveal rows of jagged, yellowed teeth. Their eyes gleamed with a malevolent light, and Amanda could feel their gaze boring into her, as though they could see into her very soul. "Run," Jake whispered, his voice trembling with terror. "Run!" But it was too late. The mirror shattered. The shards exploded outward, showering them in glass. Amanda screamed as she shielded her face, but when she looked up again, the reflections were gone. The shattered glass lay in pieces around them, but the figures, those twisted, smiling versions of themselves, were gone. And so was the exit. They were trapped. The carnival had them now, and there was no escape. The carnival was alive now. It pulsed with a malevolent energy, a living, breathing entity that had wrapped itself around Amanda, Jake, Darren, and Melanie, twisting their minds and bodies into something unrecognizable. The air itself seemed to vibrate with a dark, terrible rhythm, like the steady heartbeat of some ancient, unspeakable beast. The flickering lights of the carnival had grown dimmer, their glow barely cutting through the thick, swirling fog that enveloped the grounds. Distant, distorted music drifted through the air, an endless, warped melody that echoed with the shrieks and wails of something not quite human. They stood now in the center of it all, on a stage unlike any they had seen before. It was an old, rotting platform draped in decaying velvet, surrounded by a grotesque audience of figures that moved unnervingly in the shadows, their faces obscured by darkness. Amanda couldn't shake the feeling that the eyes of every performer, every distorted freak, were locked onto them, waiting, hungry. In front of them stood Vance, the master of ceremonies, his smile as wide and terrible as ever, his eyes glittering with cruel amusement. He stood tall and proud, the ringmaster of this hellish spectacle, his skeletal hands clapping slowly as if savoring every moment of their torment. "Well done," he purred, his voice a twisted echo in the air. "You've made it to the final act. Not many do, you know. Not many survive long enough to see the end of the show." His words slithered through Amanda's mind like poison, each one sinking deep, twisting around her thoughts until it became hard to think, hard to even remember what had brought them here in the first place. Her memories, her past, felt distant now, slipping through her fingers like sand. She could barely recall her life outside of this place, as though the carnival had swallowed it whole, devouring every shred of who she had once been. And her body, God, her body. Amanda could feel it shifting beneath her skin. It was no longer her own. Her reflection in the mirror, that grotesque, shifting mass of flesh, had become her truth. She could feel it happening, feel her skin moving, bubbling, warping uncontrollably. Every muscle, every bone, every inch of her was unraveling, reshaping itself into something monstrous. She wasn't Amanda anymore. None of them were who they used to be. Jake stood beside her, though he was a shadow of the man he had once been. His face was pale, gaunt, and twisted with anguish. His hands shook violently, covered in fresh cuts and scratches, marks that Amanda suspected had not been made by accident. His eyes were hollow now, lifeless, consumed by the darkness that had been gnawing at him from the moment they had entered the carnival. Amanda saw it in his gaze, the guilt, the fear, the loss of control. Jake was no longer fighting the darkness inside him. He had given into it. And Darren, poor Darren, he was barely coherent anymore. His skin had swollen grotesquely, stretched thin over his bones, covered in dozens of tiny mouths that whispered and cackled incessantly. His eyes darted wildly around, paranoid and frantic, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. He mumbled to himself constantly, his words a jumble of fear and madness. Melanie, once so bright and full of life, was now a trembling shell. She winced at every breath, her body hypersensitive to every touch, every sound. Her nerves had turned against her, amplifying every sensation to the point of unbearable agony. She looked at Amanda now with wide, terrified eyes, her lips trembling as though she wanted to scream but couldn't find the strength. Vance stepped closer to them, his black eyes gleaming with twisted delight. "The carnival has chosen you," he whispered, his voice wrapping around them like a snake tightening its coils. "You have been reborn in its image. You are its new stars, its newest freaks." Amanda's heart thudded painfully in her chest. No, This couldn't be how it ended. There had to be a way out. She couldn't let the carnival win, couldn't let it twist her into something she wasn't. But then a deep, aching dread settled in her bones, and she knew the truth. There was no escape. There never had been. Vance's grin widened as though he could read her thoughts. You've felt it, haven't you? The change inside you. The carnival takes what you are and makes it better. Makes you one of us. No, Amanda whispered, her voice weak, trembling. But even as she spoke, she could feel her body betraying her. Her skin rippled beneath her clothes, softening and shifting, the grotesque transformation pushing closer to the surface. Don't fight it, Vance whispered, his voice dripping with dark seduction. You'll feel so much better when you accept what you've become. Embrace the freak inside. Amanda clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms, trying to hold on to whatever fragments of herself still remained. She couldn't let go. She couldn't let the carnival take her. But when she looked at Jake, at Darren, at Melanie, she saw it in their eyes. They were already lost. Suddenly, the air around them shifted. The ground beneath their feet trembled as though the carnival itself was awakening, its hunger deepening. The audience, those shadowy, grotesque figures in the dark, began to chant in low, distorted voices. The sound reverberated through Amanda's bones, rattling her teeth, making her stomach churn. One of us. One of us. One of us. The chant grew louder, faster, until it was a deafening roar that shook the very ground beneath their feet. Amanda's breath quickened, her heart racing as the lights above them flickered wildly. Her skin, oh God, her skin was melting away now, shifting and warping uncontrollably. She could feel it changing, feel her body reshaping itself into something unnatural, something monstrous. The ground cracked open beneath them, and a dark, swirling vortex seemed to rise up from the depths, pulling at them with a terrible force. Amanda could feel it, feel the carnival dragging her down, pulling her deeper into its endless nightmare. And then she heard Vance's voice once more, soft, soothing, and full of dark promise. "Welcome to the Freak Show," he whispered. "You're home now." The ground gave way beneath her feet, and Amanda felt herself falling into the abyss, her body unraveling as she descended into the carnival's waiting embrace. She could feel it consuming her, feel her identity slipping away piece by piece, until there was nothing left but the freak the carnival had created. She was gone, and in her place something new was born. The lights above them flickered one final time before they went out completely, plunging the carnival into darkness. The chants ceased, replaced by an eerie, oppressive silence that seemed to stretch on forever. When the lights flickered back on, the stage was empty. Amanda, Jake, Darren, and Melanie were gone. In their place, 4 new performers stood, grotesque, twisted creatures, their bodies warped and broken, their faces hollow and devoid of anything human. The crowd in the shadows erupted into applause, their hands clapping wildly as the new stars of the freak show took their place among the damned. Vance smiled, satisfied. The carnival had claimed them, just as it had claimed so many before them, and it would continue, forever hungry, forever devouring. As the crowd dispersed and the carnival lights began to dim once more, Vance turned and walked toward the next town on the horizon. Another place, another group of unsuspecting souls waiting to be drawn into the carnival's web. The freak show never ended. It only moved on.